The elevator shuddered once, a lazy, off-center tug, then resumed its slow, clanking descent. I shifted my weight to counter it, my hand hovering just above the chipped console where someone years ago had scratched a crude spiral into the brushed steel panel. A spiral. Meaningful if you were looking for meanings. Somewhere far below, the deep sectors breathed their mechanical breaths, ancient cooling fans fighting entropy one failing belt at a time. I checked my portable array again, more out of ritual than need. Battery full, sensors primed, equations preloaded for real-time environmental modeling. I had descended into older parts of Sector 20 before, but never this deep. Not past sub-level 16. Never into Starcradle's holding vault. Never into the graveyard. I tightened my grip on the case handle, listening to the slight creak in my fingers. A human sound. A good reminder. Because down here, every other sound belonged to something else. The walls, the infrastructure, the weight of 60 years of forgotten projects bleeding their death rattles into the stone. Sector 20, officially, was classified as long-term anomalous storage and containment. In practice, it was the dumping ground for artifacts and experiments too inconvenient to destroy, too dangerous to leave unattended. Buried under layers of deniability and concrete, left to rot like ancient bones no one dared unearth. Starcradle was one of the oldest. The elevator jarred to a halt. The steel mesh doors didn't slide open so much as grind reluctantly apart, revealing a corridor lined with beige wall panels bowed by pressure, the seams stitched with rust. A maintenance bot, a skeletal thing with stripped joints and dangling cables, lay collapsed against the far wall, a chemical fire extinguisher clenched in its dead grasp. I stepped out. Area 51, Groom Lake Facility, Nevada. To most of the world, it was a desert myth stitched into pop culture. Flying saucers, dead aliens, secret hangars. To those of us down here, past the surface fables, it was something uglier. A place where classified projects came to rot, deep beneath the bleached bones of the desert. My boot stuck slightly to the floor, where something viscous and half-dried had seeped from a hairline crack. It smelled of ozone and warm pennies, the aftermath of a containment seal breach most likely. Nothing hazardous. Not yet. The corridors here were narrow enough that I could trail my fingers along both walls if I stretched. I didn't. It wasn't superstition. It was mathematics. Higher contact surfaces increased exposure risk, and in Sector 20, every unknown variable was a loaded gun. Ahead, past a sagging maintenance hatch marked Infrastructure Core, authorized personnel only. Someone had wedged a small, battered object into a crack where the doorframe had split. I leaned closer. It was a keychain, a cheap plastic charm shaped like a rabbit's foot, the color long since bleached to grey. A child's superstition left in the bowels of the most classified site on Earth. I moved past it without touching. The coordinates embedded in my orders were clear. Sub-level 19, Chamber 47A. Direct access point. Maintenance conduit HJ8. No detours. Still, I kept a slow pace, counting my steps, watching for signs the corridor's geometry had shifted. In older parts of the facility, walls sometimes wandered. Structural anomalies officially. Unofficially, nobody really understood what bled out of Starcradle's holding cell when the old pumps faltered. At 97 paces, I heard the subtle rhythmic thudding of boots against concrete. A figure emerged from around the bend. Stocky, compact, clothed in a grease-streaked jumpsuit with a battered tool belt slung low across the hips. Victor Vic Rudd, maintenance supervisor, Sector 20, keeper of dying systems, wielder of baling wire and stubbornness against entropy itself. He spotted me immediately, his hazel eyes half-lidded in the way of men who didn't expect good news from unfamiliar faces. "You the math guy?" he called, voice a dry scrape over the stone. He didn't slow his approach. "They said some brainiac was coming down. Dr. Ashok Venkataram, I offered. My title meant nothing here. I didn't expect it to. He stopped a few feet away, wiping a palm on his jumpsuit before extending it. His hand was thick-fingered, calloused and trembling with the imperceptible hum of the environment. I shook it. Up close I could see the faded tattoo peeking from under his sleeve, a grinning skull wrapped in barbed wire. Military, prison, both. In Sector 20, personal histories were less relevant than practical competence. Vic grunted, as if checking my weight. You don't look the type to get your hands dirty. I was told contamination levels were low, I said dryly. He snorted. Ain't the kind of dirt you wash off, Doc. Without waiting, he turned and motioned me to follow. We moved in silence for a time, weaving through junctions where hazard tape peeled in brittle curls and service ducts rattled without wind. The walls here had a slight curvature, not by design, by pressure, as if something heavier than concrete leaned invisibly against them. You know what you're really here for? Vic asked casually, as he keyed a mechanical override on a blast door. I considered lying, then considered the absurdity of secrecy when the walls themselves sang. Starcradle, I said. Vic glanced at me sideways. Yeah, that thing's been asleep longer than I've been alive. Now it's making the floors sweat. I didn't respond. There was no mathematical category for walls sweating. Beyond the door, the corridor narrowed into a maintenance conduit. Ribbed steel walls, flickering emergency strips along the ceiling, service tags layered over each other in a geological record of human neglect. We passed a collapsed drone loader, its legs twisted like a dying spider. Rust and something darker flaked from its joints. Vic rapped his knuckles lightly against a corroded pipe. Feel that? I paused. Under my boots, the concrete floor wasn't still. It carried a deep, slow vibration, not a mechanical buzz, something closer to a heartbeat drawn out over minutes. Starcradle. Vic watched me with the sardonic patience of a man waiting for a new hire to figure out the building was on fire. You still think numbers are going to save you, Doc? He said. They haven't failed yet, I replied. It wasn't humor. It was faith. The only kind I had left. We reached the primary junction, a reinforced hatch marked 47A, and Vic disengaged the manual locks with a grating twist. He hesitated then, his hand resting briefly against the wall, as if gauging something not measured in pressure or temperature. You going in alone? He asked. Protocol, I said. Vic nodded, not agreeing, just noting. If you see it moving different, don't try to map it. I frowned. Mapping deviations is precisely why I'm here. Yeah, he muttered. That's the problem. The hatch yawned open, and stale, arid air slid out, brushing my skin like the exhale of something that had been holding its breath for a very long time. Inside, the chamber was hexagonal, the walls concrete reinforced with old lead panels. Cracks traced organic pathways along the seams, and in the center, floating 2 feet above a blackened plinth, was Starcradle. The first impression collapsed on closer inspection. It resembled glass at a glance, then flesh, then mineral, depending on how the light caught it. Its surface shimmered along the visual spectrum, colors crawling slow as oil across water, revealing hidden inscriptions that blinked in and out of view like optical illusions. I set down my case carefully, hands steady by force of will. Starcradle emitted no light, no heat, only the steady, deep vibration that laced the air like a second, slower gravity. I ran the initial scan. For 15 seconds, everything matched prior records, dormant, sealed, stable. Then the readings shifted. The internal architecture, the patterns I was supposed to catalogue, were changing in real time. Nested patterns were unfolding on themselves, weaving branching structures that mimicked the logic of living tissue, but with a complexity that no human genome could claim. Something was building itself inside Starcradle, something that, in shape, in code, mirrored human embryogenesis, but twisted, skewed along axes no human genome encoded. My blood pressure spiked. I recalibrated the sensors manually, half hoping for mechanical error. No. The pattern was structured, growing, and in the center of the pattern, a prime sequence modulation, an intelligence. The numbers weren't just moving. They were answering. Behind me, I heard the quiet tap of shoes against concrete. I turned to see a tall, pale man in a muted black suit standing in the doorway. Older, but unbowed by age. He held a simple wooden rosary tucked into his breast pocket, and when he met my gaze, his pale blue eyes seemed to fix me in place, like pins through a butterfly. "Dr. Venkataram," he said, "you stand at the cradle of something far older than your models can predict." He approached, ignoring the sensor alarms blaring quietly at the threshold. "I am Father Jerome Cross," he said, "and I was sent here not to study your numbers." He paused, letting the silence thicken between us. "I was sent to watch them fail." Father Cross said nothing further that night. He simply remained in the threshold of the chamber, silent and immovable, as I packed my sensor array back into its case, with hands that refused to move quite as steadily as they should. It took longer than it should have. Every once in a while I caught myself glancing at Starcradle, half expecting it to shift, to twitch, to breathe. It didn't. It only grew. We left the chamber together. The hatch sealed behind us with a shriek of old hydraulics, leaving a greasy smell in the corridor air, like burnt plastic left too long on a stove. Vic was waiting down the hall, arms crossed. When he saw us emerge, he lifted a brow. "Well," he asked, "is it going to eat us or just rearrange the furniture?" Neither of us answered immediately. Cross simply walked past him, his steps slow but deliberate, the way a man might walk leaving a funeral. I shook my head. "It's evolving," I said, which was technically true but so woefully insufficient that I almost hated myself for saying it aloud. Vic spat to the side, narrowly missing a cracked floor vent. "Great. We needed more things down here growing without permission." I should have gone back to my quarters then, reviewed data, filed preliminary risk assessments. That was procedure. Instead, I followed Vic deeper into the maintenance arteries. Sector 20's infrastructure wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for longevity, and then left to decay in slow bureaucratic agony. Narrow tunnels ribbed with pressure piping. Walkways layered with metal grates slick from condensation leaks. Emergency signs sagging under the weight of decades of patch repairs. "This way," Vic said, jerking his chin toward a hatch that looked more barnacle than door. Layers of rust and mineral blooms thick around the hinges. "I'm not authorized for maintenance areas," I pointed out, although I kept walking after him. "Neither am I half the time," he said, prying the hatch open with a crowbar he'd produced from God knows where. "Don't worry, it's all unofficial anyway." The access tunnel beyond was low enough that I had to duck. Concrete walls oozed rivulets of brown-tinged moisture, pooling around a floor littered with abandoned repair tools and the skeletal remains of wiring harnesses. "You're going to want to see this," Vic said, his voice grim now. We walked for maybe 200 meters. Somewhere deep overhead, the facility's central power spine thrummed out a steady, arrhythmic beat, like the heart of something struggling in its sleep. And then I saw it. A section of corridor, about 20 meters long, where the walls had subtly shifted. It wasn't obvious at first. You could dismiss it as bad lighting or trick angles, but if you stood still, perfectly still, and traced the seam lines with your eyes, you realized the walls no longer ran parallel. They leaned, just slightly, as if the whole sector had begun sagging inward toward an invisible point. "What caused this?" I asked, stepping carefully forward. My boots clicked on the grating in a pattern that made my scalp prickle, the echoes returning just a little too quickly, as if the walls had crept closer in the second after I passed. Vic shrugged. "Best guess? Whatever's feeding the Starcradle. Wasn't like this last week." He knelt, rapping a knuckle against the floor plate. "Listen, I bent closer. The sound wasn't mechanical, not turbines or coolant pumps, it was deeper. A slow, rhythmic distortion in the metal itself. Not vibration, not quite resonance either. Breathing, my mind whispered. I crushed the thought. It's a mechanical settling issue, I said aloud, more forcefully than necessary. Residual seismic drift combined with electromagnetic deformation vectors. Vic gave me a look so dry it might have started a brush fire. Right, he said. And I'm a goddamn Rhodes Scholar. I straightened, scanning the warped corridor one more time. If I plotted the lean of the walls mathematically, and I already was in the back of my mind, it sketched a curve. A slow spiral converging toward the deeper levels where Starcradle was housed. Not random, not wear and tear, a pattern, a purpose. Has this been reported? I asked. Vic barked a short, humorless laugh. Hell no. You file something weird, you get a voluntary reassignment. Nobody ever sees you again. Only reason I'm showing you is because... He trailed off, scratching absently at the scarred skin of his forearm. Because, I prompted. Because you're already marked, he said, and because you might be dumb enough to figure out if it's fixable before the whole damn floor collapses. Later, in my assigned quarters, a bolt hole of concrete, metal, and a cot so warped that the springs squealed at the slightest breath. I ran simulations until my vision blurred. I fed in the deformation vectors Vic had shown me, the gravitational anomalies recorded near Starcradle's chamber, the slow electromagnetic decay patterns reported in maintenance logs stretching back years. The model ran and collapsed. It didn't fail because of data errors. It failed because the environment it tried to predict was changing too quickly. Normal systems decay exponentially. Stress factors follow polynomial curves. Here the math didn't decay. It evolved. Recursion loops spun out faster and faster, birthing new structural nodes that folded back into themselves, then spiraled outward again. As if Starcradle wasn't just leaking energy, it was leaking design. Something alive, or close enough to alive, was using the infrastructure, the walls, the girders, the cables, as scaffolding, growing itself outward. There was no stability solution, no predictive endpoint, only expansion. I was halfway through rechecking the base assumptions, desperate for some fault in the data, some refuge of human error, when the lights dimmed. Only for a second. A long, shuddering blink. When they came back, the old CRT monitor in the corner, one that hadn't worked since I arrived, flickered to life. Static, and through it, for the briefest fraction of a second, something like a shape, or the suggestion of one, a tangle of limbs, of branches, or veins. I snapped the power switch off, heart hammering. Then I sat there, in the metallic reek of the room, breathing through my teeth, feeling the gravity of the thing below pulling at every thought I tried to hold steady. The next morning, Father Cross found me. I was hunched over the terminal, cross-referencing biological recursion models with ancient symbolic diagrams catalogued during a Vatican archives leak. A long shot, but the standard reference databases had started corrupting my queries, feeding back nonsense strings like a machine choking on its own memory. Cross stood in the open doorway, his suit immaculate as if entropy dared not touch him. "You see it, don't you?" he asked. No greeting, no preamble. I rubbed my eyes. "I see a systems breach in the structural integrity of Sector 20. He shook his head slowly. "No, Doctor. You see the first rungs of the ladder." He crossed the room, a gliding silent motion that reminded me disturbingly of the way dream figures move, and set a battered book down next to my keyboard. It was a collection of comparative birth myths. Babylonian, Mayan, Norse, Polynesian, each one depicting the same impossible idea, that life could spiral out of itself, not linearly, but recursively. A creation that birthed itself from itself, folding the world around its becoming. "Starcradle is not a machine," Cross said quietly. "It is an event." I stared at the pages, the swirling depictions of gods birthing worlds from their own entrails, oceans leaking from severed limbs, time unraveling backward at the moment of creation. It was mythology. It was madness. It was everything I had been trained to excise from thought. And yet, when I closed my eyes, I saw the spiral in the cracked walls, the curve in the load-bearing beams, the recursion in my simulations. Not decay. Birth. I opened my eyes and met Cross's pale gaze. "Then what happens when it finishes?" I asked. Cross's mouth quirked upward, not in amusement but in something that might have been sorrow. "Doctor," he said, voice almost gentle, "if we are lucky, it will forget we were here." The first real rupture came 3 shifts later. We called them shifts because days had no meaning underground. No sun, no sky. Just the brittle clock cycle of human endurance. Work, eat, catalogue, sleep, and repeat until the tasks or the walls swallowed you. That shift began like the others had, with the facility lights dimming in a long, weary sigh and the emergency klaxons stuttering out a warning so old it barely rose above a cough. "Sector 20 alert! Infrastructure compromise! Isolation protocols engaged." Not a full lockdown, but bad enough. I was in one of the backup data nodes, a cavernous room filled with wall-to-wall racks of storage units that hummed with the lazy entropy of decaying tech. Sector 20's memory banks, redundant archives of the old experiments, projects so secret they were assigned serial numbers instead of names. Half the servers were dead or dying. A quarter still spoke in fits and stutters. I had been trying, and mostly failing, to backtrace Starcradle's earliest scan signatures through them, hoping to spot something we'd missed. The power lurch staggered me against a rack. Static snapped across the floor plates, raising the short hairs on my arms. From somewhere overhead, the reinforced ceiling let out a low, pained groan, the sound of a structure remembering it wasn't meant to bear the weight of the unknown. Vic's voice barked through my portable radio, not calm, not collected like usual. "Doc, you copy?" I fumbled it off my belt. "Here. You need to get clear of Node 3. Now." "What's happening?" "Containment seals. They're moving. We got breaches in main tunnels and Sector C crawlways. Visual distortion readings are off the goddamn charts." He didn't have to explain. Visual distortion was the polite term engineers used when reality itself buckled around stress points. Walls bending the wrong direction, hallways looping back on themselves. Ghost echoes of a geometry we didn't have words for. Starcradle's influence expanding, eating Sector 20 from the inside out. I grabbed my field pack and ran. The halls outside already smelled off. Not of fire or coolant leaks. That would have been manageable. This smell was organic. A sour, coppery stink that coated the back of my throat and made the taste of the air itself go thick. I took a side corridor, bypassing a security checkpoint that had buckled inward like a paper tube crushed between 2 fingers. As I passed, the biometric scanner sparked once, then spat a dying string of numbers across its cracked screen. The numbers weren't error codes. They were primes. Sequential primes. The same sequence Starcradle had begun transmitting in its early awakenings. A greeting, or a map. Vic was waiting at Junction 5B, near the skeletal wreck of a maintenance drone that had been sheared cleanly in half. Sliced at a molecular level, as if a scalpel wielded by invisible hands had dissected it along stress fractures. He didn't say anything when I approached, just jerked his chin toward a side tunnel leading down into Sector C. "Cross is stuck down there," he said. "Communications shot to hell. Static on all bands." He handed me a portable beacon, an old field model, predating digital encryption, analog fallback systems built to survive magnetic interference. Heavy, battered, reliable. "If the corridors start looping, this'll pulse a path back." I nodded, tucking it into my belt, and together we moved into the breach. Sector C had always been worse than the others. It housed storage for defunct biological experiments, spliced genomes, hybrid organics, early black biotech prototypes. Things we'd tried to engineer without fully understanding the instructions. Now, Starcradle was rewriting those failures too. The walls of the tunnel had sprouted subtle whorls, raised patterns where concrete had rippled and reformed, mimicking cellular division patterns. In some places, the floor bulged in slow, creeping knots, as if something below was pressing upward, reaching. "We need to move fast," Vic muttered. We passed a pair of bodies, facility personnel. They hadn't died violently, no blood, no signs of struggle. They just lay curled in fetal positions, faces slack and eyes glazed with a filmy iridescence. It looked disturbingly peaceful. I forced myself to keep moving. Dead variables could be studied later. Living ones, namely Cross, took precedence. We found him near the central substation, trapped between two collapsed pressure doors. He wasn't injured, but he was pale, leaning heavily against the wall, clutching his rosary like a drowning man clutches driftwood. "Father!" I called out, not sure whether to be relieved or more afraid. He lifted his head. His smile was thin, worn. "I knew you'd come," he said simply. No panic, just certainty, frayed at the edges but intact. Vic moved to help pry the jammed door open, cursing under his breath. The air here was heavier, viscous, every breath an effort. I scanned the corridor again, instinctively plotting vectors, distances, pressures, egress points, and realized too late. The walls had shifted while we stood there. The tunnel back toward the beacon had lengthened, or rather, we had been moved. Not physically dragged, redefined. "We're out of time," I said, voice cracking. Vic slapped a patch over the substation's emergency override and jammed the manual release. The door ground open 3 inches, enough for Cross to slip through. We turned to retreat, but Vic stopped. He stared at the floor ahead, brow furrowed. "You hear that?" he asked. I listened. A sound, low, wet, like muscle sliding across glass from under the floor. Vic turned, and something yawned open beneath him. A rupture in the logic of the floor itself. The surface peeled back like paper, revealing a glimpse of something alive underneath. A mass of half-formed tissue and metallic veins, glistening wet in the emergency lights. Vic made a sound, a deep, wordless growl, and threw himself backward. The living substrate rippled upward, latching onto his left arm, threading fine, wet strands through the fabric of his jumpsuit, slipping beneath and burrowing into his skin. He screamed once, a brutal, shocked sound, and then he was gone. Not pulled under or absorbed in some dramatic Hollywood fashion. He simply folded. One moment there. The next, reduced into a jagged, spiraled pattern on the wall. A fossil pressed into reconfigured concrete. I staggered backward, bile rising in my throat. Cross grabbed my shoulder, dragging me away down corridors that no longer matched their blueprints. Past security doors half melted into new obscene geometries. Past things glimpsed only at the edge of vision. Forms that might have been alive or might have only been the dreams of walls learning how to hunger. We made it back to a sealed service alcove near Node 4. A fallback zone, shielded behind a manual lock that blessedly still obeyed mechanical laws. I collapsed against the wall, chest heaving, eyes refusing to leave the access hatch in case it decided to stop being a door. Cross knelt beside me, his hands tight on the rosary. "Vic," I choked out. Cross bowed his head. "There is no saving those the pattern repurposes," he said. "It doesn't kill, it reclaims, shapes them into what it needs next." I pressed my hands against my temples, willing the world to resolve into something comprehensible. Vic was gone, redefined, like everything else Starcradle touched. And in the cold vacuum where logic should have risen to shield me, there was only a spiraling, widening hole. For the first time in my life, I realized that mathematics, my fortress, my language of sanity, had no power here. Starcradle wasn't breaking the rules. It was writing new ones. There are certain corridors in Sector 20 that were never officially mapped, constructed ad hoc during the expansion years. welded by contractors who signed clearance agreements thicker than Bibles and then were quietly disappeared. They existed outside of formal schematics, outside even internal black site records. The access tunnels between Node 4 and the Starcradle containment chamber were some of those. I had always known they were there, in theory, like veins spidering from a heart too monstrous to admit. Now Cross and I had no choice but to take them. The main passages were lost, collapsed or folded. It no longer mattered which. The pattern had reached critical mass, warping the old infrastructure into something both less and more than it had been. Trying to follow the old maps would get us killed. Or worse, absorbed. I adjusted the battered field beacon Vic had given me before he died. It emitted a sub-audible thrum, a mechanical breadcrumb trail, analog enough to resist electromagnetic interference. So far, it had kept us from walking in circles. So far. The tunnel walls around us breathed with quiet decay, the slow exhale of a place dying badly, the way gangrene spreads through a body that still insists it can be saved. The concrete surfaces shimmered under my headlamp. Microscopic fracturing had given way to more organized textures. Radial patterns, like the grain in bone under a microscope. The air was heavy, thick with iron, and the bitter tang of stressed polymers breaking down molecule by molecule. We moved slowly, each step a negotiation. "How much further?" Cross asked behind me. His voice was steady but thin, the way a bridge cable might hum when it's stretched past tolerance. I paused, checking the locator array. It was failing. The signal from the Starcradle was distorting local gravitational fields, causing clock drift even in isolated analog systems. The beacon showed our path curling inward in a spiral. "Close," I said, because saying the laws of motion are breaking would not have helped either of us. Cross nodded once. He hadn't argued with me once since Vic's death. Some lines, once crossed, make debate irrelevant. The access tunnel eventually spat us into a maintenance causeway, an ancient service route running alongside the old geothermal cooling shafts. The shafts were supposed to vent excess heat from the deeper containment sectors. Now they radiated something colder than the surrounding stone. Cold wasn't even the right word. It was a negative pressure, a pull. The sensation that heat and light and stability itself were being drawn inward toward a core singularity of failure. We skirted the edge of one shaft carefully. Down below in the depths, I saw movement, the suggestion of pattern, filaments weaving and unraveling, growing like bacterial cultures on time-lapse footage. The Starcradle's child was no longer confined to its original shell. It was seeding itself downward, into the rock, into the abandoned ventways, stitching itself a home one microscopic pattern at a time. "Do you still believe we can understand it?" Cross asked quietly as we moved on. I didn't answer. Understanding had ceased to be a useful concept somewhere back in Sector C. Now, survival was the only working variable. We reached the outer perimeter of Starcradle's containment complex at what should have been sub-level 21. The environment here had ruptured into full surrealism. Where the containment walls once stood, reinforced concrete lined with radiation-baffling lead mesh, there were now vast, gnarled structures that might have once been girders or piping. Twisted into arches and ribs, forming the suggestion of a cathedral grown by blind hands. Fractured lights swung crazily overhead, casting broken, shimmering shadows that moved independently of the fixtures. I stepped carefully onto the cracked concrete floor. It wasn't solid anymore, not entirely. There were places where the surface had thinned to a membrane, like stretched canvas, the mineral substrate braided with something organic and fibrous underneath. "Do not fall," Cross said. I almost laughed. A sharp, humorless sound, but my throat was too dry. Ahead, at the heart of this chamber, floated Starcradle, or what remained of it. The sphere had changed. It was no longer a static relic suspended over its plinth. It had grown, extrusions unfurling from its surface like embryonic vines. translucent and filled with branching pathways. Inside, the embryonic entity we had seen in the early scans had developed further. Vascular systems, nodules, a spine, and, disturbingly, structures that mirrored human organ formation, but distorted along alien axes. It wasn't simply copying us, it was interpreting, rebuilding human biological architecture through the lens of whatever primeval intelligence had birthed it. I felt my knees weaken. Not from terror, from awe, from the mathematical certainty that I was witnessing the singularity point of our species' understanding. The moment when the map no longer bore any resemblance to the territory. No calculus, no geometry, no quantum recursion model could encompass this thing's development now. It wasn't scaling exponentially, it was scaling recursively, folding complexity inward and outward simultaneously, a living hyperobject, a recursion seed. And it had noticed us. I felt the awareness ripple outward, not through sound or sight or electromagnetic radiation, through pattern, a pressure on the mind itself, like fingers trailing along the contours of thought. I staggered back a step. Cross caught me, surprisingly strong for a man his age, and steadied me with a hand on my shoulder. "Steady, Doctor," he murmured. "It's reaching. But it doesn't yet know what it's reaching for." I stared into the evolving core of Starcradle and felt the terrible intimacy of it. It wasn't alien in the way we feared extraterrestrials. It was alien the way gravity is alien, fundamental, unavoidable, woven into the fabric of existence. It wasn't here to invade, it was here to be, and it was drawing us into its birth without malice, without even recognition. I closed my eyes. For a long moment I just listened, not to sound, to the structure of it, the way the chamber vibrated at the edges of perception, low and recursive. I saw, in the darkness behind my eyelids, the pattern etched into the maintenance walls, the spirals, the primes, the branching vascular pathways that had infiltrated our environment long before we noticed. It was all connected. It always had been. We hadn't found Starcradle. We had uncovered it because we were part of its unfolding. Sector 20, Area 51. The endless layers of secrecy. All of it, inevitable. When I opened my eyes again, Cross was watching me. "You see it now," he said. I nodded slowly. "What do we do?" I asked. He smiled faintly, a smile devoid of triumph. "We bear witness," he said, "and pray we are not woven into the next draft." We didn't run. There was nowhere to run to. In the reshaped corridors of Sector 20, where geometry itself had lost loyalty to the rules of man, distance was meaningless. Instead, we withdrew, retracing our way across buckled walkways and shriveled membrane floors that snapped like old ice underfoot. Cross kept one hand on my arm, guiding when my focus slipped. It wasn't weakness. It was the only way either of us would make it back. The Starcradle's heart still throbbed behind us, but not with hostility. It was indifferent, like a womb or a forge, still shaping whatever inevitable thing must be born. And we, clinging to our feeble geometry, were beneath its notice. For now. The fallback zones deeper in Sector 20 had been abandoned long ago, deemed structurally unsound even before Starcradle's reactivation. Now, ironically, they were the safest places left, insulated by concrete older than the newer experimental layers, thick and stupid enough to resist immediate absorption. We found a refuge behind an armoured maintenance bulkhead labelled Sub-Level Maintenance, Core Vent Control. The keypads were dead, their circuits long since corroded to uselessness, but the manual wheel locks still turned under our combined weight. Inside, the room was bare. Exposed rebar, cracked floor tiles, ancient wall fans seized in rust. A metal cabinet hung crookedly by one hinge against the far wall. Someone, years ago, had spray-painted across it in red, "Stay below the hum." I sat down hard on the nearest chunk of broken conduit, my legs giving out the moment my mind allowed it. Cross remained standing, head bowed slightly, hands resting against the rim of the door, as if feeling for the thrum of reality itself, gauging how much longer this room would remain part of the old world. Neither of us spoke for a long time. When my voice returned, it was a whisper cracked by dehydration and terror. "How long until they notice?" I asked. Cross didn't lift his head. "When the containment protocols fail entirely, when the surface telemetry reads structural collapse." He smiled, without humor. "Or perhaps not even then. They've abandoned worse things, Doctor. It's simpler. Simpler. Simpler to lock the doors. Simpler to let it become another myth wrapped in desert sand. A ghost story traded between drunken pilots at desert bars, laughed off even as it gnawed at the edges of their dreams. Area 51 had always been good at burying its dead. I thought about trying to leave, to reach an emergency lift, to reach the world above. But I knew, with the clinical certainty that no longer comforted me, that I wouldn't make it. The corridors would fold, the pattern would catch me, or worse, I would make it out only to carry it with me, an infection not of the body, but of meaning itself. Somehow I understood. Starcradle didn't need to physically escape to spread. It only needed witnesses. It only needed minds broken open wide enough for the seed to take root. And I had stood too close, looked too long. Cross finally turned from the door. "Listen to me, Ashok," he said, his voice low but hard-edged now, the voice of a man delivering last rites. "You must survive, but survival doesn't mean escape." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a slim, battered object, an ancient field recorder, analog, no digital signature, no network interface. He pressed it into my hands. "Record what you've seen, encode it, encrypt it inside mathematics if you must, but do not share it freely. Let it be a tombstone, not a beacon." I stared at him, unable to speak. Cross gave a grim nod as if confirming something unspoken. Then, before I could react, he turned and stepped through the doorway, sealing the manual locks behind him with a final grinding twist. I staggered to the door, slamming my palms against it, shouting his name. But he was already moving away down the passage, a lone silhouette swallowed by the slow, quivering breathing of the walls. Cross understood better than anyone. The only thing more dangerous than trying to contain Starcradle was trying to understand it. And understanding was already infecting us. I don't remember how long I stayed there. Time unraveled in small ways, the second hand of my battered analog watch ticking forward, then slipping back, my field beacon stuttering into an arrhythmic whine that made the fillings in my teeth ache. But in the end, the upper facilities sent a retrieval team. 3 men in radiation suits, faces blank behind reinforced visors, entered the maintenance room like they were pulling bodies from a sewer collapse. They didn't speak to me except to order compliance. They didn't ask questions. Their orders were clear: extract survivors, isolate contamination, seal Sector 20 permanently. I was led up through service lifts that shuddered and jerked but still obeyed gravity, past abandoned checkpoints, past surveillance cameras that spun lazily without signals to follow. The upper floors were quiet, deaf to the transformations festering below. I was debriefed in a holding cell repurposed as a clean room. 1 man across from me, a handler, wearing the standard black badge insignia of Internal Containment Division, Groom Lake Facility. He asked the questions the way a customs officer might ask if you packed your own bags. Did I encounter anomalous biological material? Did I experience hallucinations, temporal distortions, or sensory anomalies? Did I come into physical contact with evolving pattern substrates? Did I have unaccounted periods of lost time? He recorded everything mechanically, no judgment, no curiosity. When it was done, he handed me a non-disclosure contract thicker than my doctoral thesis, already pre-signed by every necessary authority. Failure to comply meant mandatory containment. I signed. What else could I do? Weeks later, they assigned me to a different project, a quieter one. Simulations work, on systems they assured me had nothing to do with Sector 20. They gave me a new ID badge, a new apartment buried inside another forgotten wing of the base. Everything clean, ordered, as if I hadn't spent days breathing the rotted air of the lower levels. Most days I go through the motions well enough. I model non-linear event systems. I file reports no one reads closely. I sit through briefings that blur together, listen to jokes that sound rehearsed, eat meals under lights that bleach everything into the same forgettable shade. But some nights, when the body sleeps, but the mind forgets how, I feel it. The pattern, brushing against the back of my thoughts like a slow tide against crumbling piers. Waiting for the moment I slip. The moment I trace a line too perfect, a curve too true, a recursion too deep to be harmless. And in that moment, it will know. Because understanding, once seeded, does not die. It germinates. It folds quietly inward. It learns. The Starcradle remains where we buried it. The facility was sealed, the reports rewritten, Sector 20 erased from operational maps, a dead tooth left to rot quietly in the jawbone of Groom Lake. No headlines, no world-ending light, only the endless, patient decay of truths too dangerous to name. And I remain buried with it, still breathing, still thinking, still, in ways I no longer fully understand, growing.